Hello and welcome to episode 3 of GDP, Gross Domestic Provocation. I'm Jeremy Hudson, and as usual, I'm here with my two more esteemed colleagues, economist Dan Altman
Full of esteem, thank you.
and hedge fund trader Jason Freeman.
Aloha, not that esteemed.
So I don't know about you guys, but I'm getting pretty tired of buying tickets for things like sporting events and concerts. The World Cup final is about 10 miles from my house, and it's 9 months away, and I've already basically given up any hope of going to any of the matches. For anything that's vaguely worth going to, it's super hard to get tickets. I'm there trying to log into Ticketmaster on time, only to find myself about 3 millionth in the queue because of all the bots. If there are any tickets left by the time you're at the front of the queue, they're either about 17 miles from the stage or you're sitting behind a pillar. My wife is a huge BTS fan, so we went to the concert at the SoFi Stadium in LA. We literally had the second to last row in that huge stadium and spent about 2 hours watching Seven Little Dots dance around. And if you can't get a ticket at face value, you can always go to a reseller site and buy them for like 10x the price from someone who used a bot to buy a ticket. To be fair, I paid over the odds to watch my team, the mighty Crystal Palace, win the FA Cup final last season. I was happy to do so. But honestly, I'd rather that extra money go to the club instead of a ticket tout or a scalper. One way to potentially stop the bots is dynamic pricing. Dynamic pricing's actually been around for ages. You know the guy sitting next to you on the plane probably paid 20% less for the same seat. And of course, everyone's familiar with Uber prices going up when it's raining. On the face of it, dynamic pricing makes sense, right? Prices go up when there's more demand, yet somehow the introduction of dynamic pricing into sporting events and music has caused all kinds of kerfuffle. So today we're going to do a deep dive on dynamic pricing and what it means for businesses, consumers, and how we buy things. Dan, please jump in so I don't spend the rest of the podcast ranting.
Oh, I'm always ready to jump in on a kerfuffle. That's my favorite thing to jump into. Yeah, I mean, dynamic pricing, as you say, it's been around a long time, and it's been a form of what economists call price discrimination. And price discrimination is basically just how can you charge different people different prices for the same product. I think to make sense of it, you have to take a step back and think about what a transaction really is. You know, there's a buyer and there's a seller, and the buyer has some maximum price they're willing to pay, and the seller has some minimum price they're willing to accept. And those prices have to be different for the transaction to take place. The question is, who gets the most of that gap, right? Is it the buyer who is getting an especially low price that they're happy about, or is the seller getting an especially high price that they're happy about? And what price discrimination does is it essentially helps the seller to get as much of that gap as they can. So they're the ones extracting the maximum benefit from each transaction. Now, there are different types of price discrimination. You know, a very simple type is just a volume discount. You get to pay less per product if you buy more. In that case, it doesn't matter when you buy it or who you are or anything like that. It's just how much you buy. We also have price discrimination, which is based on what group you might be in. And that group can be identified in different ways. It could be a senior citizen discount where they're trying to say, well, seniors can't pay quite as much, but we still want their business, so we charge them a little less. Or it could be for airline tickets, you know, if you have a Saturday stayover, maybe that identifies you as a leisure traveler rather than a business traveler. And so you might pay a little bit less because you don't have a corporate expense account paying for you. But then the third type of price discrimination is the type that every business dreams of, which is basically being able to charge each consumer the maximum that they're willing to pay, and to charge a different price to each consumer if those maximum amounts differ. Now, how could you actually do that, right? You would actually really need to know a ton about each consumer to be able to guess exactly the right price to charge them. And to get that amount of data, you have to be tracking them all the time, right? Is this starting to sound familiar yet, by the way? Which is why the dynamic pricing that achieves this is being called by some legal scholars surveillance pricing, because you're basically trying to keep tabs on everything the consumer is doing, so you know exactly how much they're willing to pay. Now, for soccer matches, concerts, we don't have surveillance pricing yet. We have a situation where it's based on demand. People who use ride shares like Uber or Lyft are familiar with this already. But for airline tickets, some airlines have been experimenting with trying to charge different people different prices just based on what they think their ability to pay might be. And that could be based on what type of device you're using, what type of operating system are you using, where are you coming from, for example? Are you ordering your tickets from the United States or from Germany or maybe from India? And that's the part that I think is getting people's dander up a little bit, that they could be buying a ticket at exactly the same time for exactly the same flight as another person who's doing it exactly the same time and actually get charged a different price. So the question is, should this be controversial or should this be legal? Is it something that consumers are willing to accept in exchange for other benefits that might come from their data? And what does it mean for companies? I mean, Jason, what do you think it means for corporate profits, for living standards, things like that?
Well, I mean, it's obviously been a lot more in focus in the events that we've had recently in terms of, Oasis and other contents like that. But then one could argue it's a kind of, monetization of emotion. So you've had a few studies that have been done since the turn of the century because obviously this kind of pricing behavior has been around in various industries like airlines, concert tickets, and that sort of stuff for some time. So if you look at these studies, there's a number of them that show that the correlation between using dynamic pricing and company performance, it increases profitability up to 22% and revenues up to 10%. So there are a bunch of these studies that people can probably find themselves and have access to. So, one of them was called Dynamic Pricing and Revenue Management Theory and Practice by Phillips and Chang, done as a while ago in 2010. And that showed dynamic pricing can increase revenue and profitability by 5 to 20%, depending on the industry and depending on the product or service. So obviously, it's very dependent on the nature of how they apply the actual dynamic pricing model to the sector they're involved in. So there was
That's
another
not
one.
chump change. I mean, 20%, that's a lot, right?
And I
It
bet
is.
it's even more now. That was, like these companies have even more data on us nowadays.
Well, you have to say that it's a range. I mean, so obviously these studies are typically that you find in terms of looking at this in detail tend to be older, and obviously technology is advanced since then. If you look at the range of the studies, it's a range of, say, sort of as little as 4%, but as much as 20% in terms of increases in revenue and probability. So it's not necessarily set in stone. Now, the one recent one I think which is interesting to highlight is one which was done by a research academic at Columbia Business School and focused on Uber. And it concluded since 2023, Uber had used algorithmic price discrimination that actually increased rider fares, but actually cut drivers' pay at the same
God.
time. And it was done very systematically, very selectively, and very opaquely. So Uber's use of dynamic pricing, according to this study, led higher fares for passengers and lower earnings for drivers, which also analysed the actual increase in revenue share that they had, and it went from 25 to 29% once dynamic pricing was introduced. So that implies it's good for companies, but then if we believe in demand and supply being the most efficient form of price discovery, surely dynamic pricing is obviously enhancing this process. But that study would imply that it's negative for the actual workers and it's negative for the consumers.
Yeah, I mean, that is amazing that Uber, which is a two-sided marketplace, right, where they have the drivers on one side and they have the consumers on the other side, is able to use essentially dynamic pricing to screw both sides. So
Yeah.
consumers end up paying more, the drivers get less, and they take a bigger margin from each side. That's insane. And it really speaks to this K-shaped economy that we talk about all the time, that the tech companies are making money hand over fist, whereas the average Joes and Janes are seeing their living standards stagnate. I mean, this seems like exactly the sort of thing that would cause that to happen.
Exactly, and it just seems to be a recurring theme in terms of in multiple kind of angles you approach it. But the companies and the multinationals will argue that dynamic pricing obviously does enhance consumer options and a household wealth to a degree. Because, for example, I guess when you're looking for booking travel during the week, you get a massive discount for sometimes traveling midweek or via a particular airline or going to a particular hotel. And I guess those opportunities wouldn't be available if we didn't have dynamic pricing. But also at the same time, those opportunities rarely come up. And it's just they're not really the kind of default case in terms of the corporate profitability model.
Going back to the Uber example, I mean, obviously it sucks that, consumers pay more and drivers get less, but to play devil's advocate, the consumers are obviously willing to pay that and the drivers are willing to accept it. If they weren't, they would go to another ride sharing service. So is it really that bad?
So that's a great question, because it deals with a concept called allocative efficiency, which is the person who values some product or service the most actually the one who's getting it? And that makes the economy more efficient, right? And price discrimination could be part of letting that happen. The classic example, there's a paper actually by a guy named Erzl Lutmer that I went to grad school with, looks at rent-controlled apartments. Rent control means that a limited number of people get these low-price apartments, but are they the ones who need it the most? That's the allocative question, right? Are they allocated to the people who need them the most? If you have this kind of price discrimination, you could say, well, the people who are willing to pay the most are the ones who are actually going to get it. But with this surveillance pricing, it's not quite the same thing, because surveillance pricing means that each person pays their maximum, no matter who they are or whether they value it the most. Each person is the one paying their maximum. And so it does part of the job in that it identifies people who are willing to pay a lot, but it doesn't necessarily mean that only the ones who are willing to pay the most are the ones who get the product. It means that anybody who walks through the door is going to pay the most that they possibly would. So it's only part of that problem solved. But Jason, I think there might be other benefits to having companies use our data, right?
Well, there could be benefits to it in the sense that one of my former colleagues at one of my former institutions was a very maths genius, PhDs in multiple disciplines in maths and computing. So interestingly enough, he'd come from Amazon, and he'd actually talked about how the Amazon kind of search engine works. And it was fascinating in the sense that he said, well, it's terabytes of information when you actually click to search for something on the web page that the search goes through, and it returns answers within milliseconds. It has to have algos which actually recognize where you live. It has data on you in terms of like a makeup of your demographic, if you're married, if you have kids, and that's how it actually is much more efficient in terms of narrowing down the search queries. So that data is useful in terms of obviously building up a picture of yourself as a consumer, so they can actually target more specific goods and services towards you, which are much more tailored to your needs. But then there's a downside to that as well, right? Obviously, this data being that such a very clever, accurate data profile already being established. And obviously, we're seeing that in other avenues in terms of social media.
So you're saying that the upside is basically that a company like Amazon, when you search for something, can actually use your data to show you things that are more relevant to you and that you might actually want to buy.
Correct.
Got it.
Yeah, I think there's some benefit to that, especially if you're searching for a product that might have 100 different variations. But if you're searching for a specific thing that you always buy and you want to continue buying it, like there's only one brand of mayonnaise that I buy. It's the best brand of mayonnaise. There's no other mayonnaise that can compete with that. And I just want to buy that mayonnaise. I don't necessarily want to get gouged as much as possible for my mayonnaise. I'm not getting anything in return in that case.
I think, can you share the brand with the rest of the world, Dan? So
I don't know. Did they pay for a product placement? Is there a sponsorship here?
we can try.
I think any chef probably knows that it's Hellman's mayonnaise.
Dan, as an economist, and one aspect of this dynamic pricing is an element of like demand in elasticity in terms of a particular product, particular time. So one interesting one that the study that came up was one of the big pub groups over here that owns Slug and Letters, which is a chain of like fairly awful pubs. But they announced.
You want to tell us the brand?
They're better than Witherspoons now.
I mean, most chain pubs are fairly old, but let's not be too harsh. But so they announced that basically at some point last year they'd be raising the price of a pint by 20p at peak times to cover costs. But then there was a poll of consumers by, I think one of the banks may be HSBC or Barclays, and they said that poll said 52% of all consumers had experienced that kind of rush hour peak pricing like in a pub, but only 8% were willing to pay for it. So, but they still pay for it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, the soccer tournaments are maybe a good example of whether that could work. We know that FIFA is planning to use dynamic pricing for the 2026 World Cup, and as Jeremy bemoaned, the prices look extraordinary already. But there will be dynamic pricing, and there was actually an article in The Athletic suggesting that people wait until the last minute to buy tickets so that the system would assume that there was less demand, I guess, and the ticket prices might go down so that you could buy them at a very low rate at the last minute. I mean, we had the Club World Cup in the United States, which also had dynamic pricing. Apparently, Jeremy, there were some situations where the prices went down a lot, right?
Yeah, so funnily enough, dynamic pricing I guess, can work in the favor of the consumers. So, yeah, as you said, we had the Club World Cup this summer in the US. I hope we could have another podcast on like whether that's worthwhile tournament or not. But one
There's
of
a
the
big gold trophy in
semifinals.
the Oval Office. Isn't that all that matters?
That's right. That's right.
Guilty
So
winning anything is not good for society.
So one of the semi-finals, Chelsea versus Fluminense, the original price for a ticket was $474, which is already insane.
Wow.
Guess what the lowest final price was of a ticket,
$50.
Jason?
Oof. I'll go 75.
$13.40,
Wow.
That's insane.
which is insane. So I don't know how FIFA, what model they use to estimate the demand for this, but they clearly got it incredibly wrong.
Well, the thing is, I mean, a game like that, right? You've got a couple of different groups of consumers, and price discrimination is about trying to separate them out. So you start the price at $474, and every crazy Brazilian Fluminense fan who lives in New Jersey buys a ticket at that price. And then a few random Chelsea fans who a London friend of mine used to refer to as Darren's and Jason's, no offense, Jason, um, would would buy tickets after that, and then you're relying on families in New Jersey who feel like a big day out and don't really even know where Fluminense is from. So they, maybe $13 is what they're willing to pay. But the thing is, FIFA doesn't necessarily want to fill the stadium, right? They're a monopolist, and so they just want to maximize their profits. That doesn't mean selling to everybody who could want a ticket. It means trying to get the maximum revenue out of each possible consumer at whatever the price may be. And this kind of price discrimination allows them to sort of, to use an economics term, go down the demand curve, starting with the people who are willing to pay the most and then lower the price until everybody else can come in. It just means that if you really do want a ticket, how long are you willing to wait, right? How long are you willing to wait just to see if the price will go down even further?
Yeah, and I guess clearly they didn't care about filling the stadiums. I mean, some of these matches with, that amateur team from New Zealand or the Korean team had like three men and a dog at them. And, just watching them on TV, it was pretty embarrassing to see the empty stadiums.
I was one of those three men and a dog watching
Oh,
Hyundai against Fluminense. Actually, it was a great game. It ended 4-2. There was a lot of back and forth. You saw Thiago Silva, the old man, still playing his trade. I would have paid more than $13. I did pay more than
I was
$13.
going to, yeah, how much did you pay for your ticket?
Which says you were supporting Fluminense.
I didn't have a dog in that fight. I didn't bring my dog. But tickets, I believe tickets for that I paid were about $60-$70. Not too bad.
But the thing is that there's an aspect of and this would probably a topic for another show, that the mechanics behind football, in terms of, especially in Europe, looking at the Super League, looking at the Premier League, the guys running the game are much more focused on the TV deals, the marketing deals, and that sort of stuff. And they refer to fans, bizarrely, who are regular home season ticket holders, as legacy fans. So they don't particularly care about the stadiums necessarily, especially FIFA, I imagine, the stadiums being full. It looks bad for them on a global stage if that happens in the World Cup, but tournaments like this, where the kind of purpose is to raise the profile of a bunch of Saudi teams, raise the profile of the US a little bit before the World Cup. I mean, they don't necessarily care that the tickets are sold out, I know.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. And the thing is, for clubs, though, and Jeremy mentioned it earlier, he said he'd like Crystal Palace to get some of that money when the prices go up on the secondary market. Dynamic pricing could help them to do that, but they're always torn between these two objectives of making money and taking care of their fans who can't necessarily afford these high prices, but have been loyal to them for decades. So it's a tough place for them to be. But going back to the overall point about dynamic pricing, I think a lot of people are uncomfortable with the sort of surveillance pricing level of price discrimination. And then the question becomes, what can you do to avoid that? Can you game the system the way The Athletic is suggesting? You could try and hide your data if you think that you would be charged a high price. You could go incognito on your browser or use a VPN or something like that, or have somebody else try and buy something for you. But, all of that is inefficient, right? I mean, it means you're basically doing side transactions on top of the transaction where you're actually trying to buy the thing you want. And so it feels like whatever gains you're getting from the data being used, you're losing in terms of just deadweight loss of spending time trying to get around the system. Another thing you could do is just go to the store, right? I mean, they can't charge different prices to different people at the store. The prices are listed on the shelves at your drugstore or supermarket. But it's these other things like the airline tickets and the concert tickets where we buy them online and then we're part of this market, which is turning into a crazy auction where you've got someone spying on you.
Are there basic things that people can do to try to, if they're obviously still forced down the route of using these various apps or websites to purchase these tickets or events? I've heard things as like basic as make sure you empty your basket whilst you're surfing for various things every now and again, because then the algo won't be able to track. And then obviously the algo adjusts to you being interested in that particular item in the basket, or using VPNs as another way as to actually disguise where you are, what your demographic is, and that sort of stuff. I mean, these sound like very basic things, but do they work? I've no idea.
On the VPN point, I mean, Dan mentioned it too, but I think it could work the other way, right? Like companies could think, well, if you're savvy enough and wealthy enough to pay for a VPN and use it, maybe we should charge you more.
Yeah,
It could
true.
work that way.
I mean, just the amount of time that we're spending thinking about this
Yeah.
is inefficient. But I think it could actually be inefficient for companies too, in a way, because if people are trying to game the system, then all the money that companies put into surveillance pricing could be wasted. Also, if people are doing what the Athletic suggests and they're delaying their purchases or trying to time it, that makes revenue a lot lumpier for companies. It makes their demand forecast much more difficult. And it's just like, what ends up being the point of all this? I guess 20% increase in revenue or profit could be a pretty powerful argument, but it just seems like there are a lot of inefficiencies that happen around this.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if you can get like the whole of the world to hold off until the last day before the World Cup final to buy a ticket. There's going to be some people along the way who are like, okay, I'm willing to pay $2,000 or whatever.
Yeah, but the thing is, here's one more point, and it just occurred to me as we're talking. If some people are paying $2,000 and some people are paying $13, is there a sort of cross subsidization going on? Are those people who can afford to pay $2,000 making it possible for a few other people to get in at $13, and so it's almost progressive in a way? But I don't know if I'm totally convinced of this, because again, we don't have a guarantee of allocative efficiency here, but it makes me wonder whether this actually could open the door to those concerts and soccer matches to some people who might otherwise not have been able to afford them.
I mean, that's supposedly how airline seats work, I think. Like when I've always heard that business class subsidizes the economy class.
Yeah, though these days sometimes I think they care so much more about it that they don't care if the plane flies half empty. As long as business class is full, it's profitable. In fact, they save on fuel if they don't have to sell those other seats.
That's a good point.
But I mean, if we didn't have dynamic pricing, what other ways would there be to kind of allocate the scarcity? I mean, I think a lot of times because there's so much emotion attached to the particular events, like people, people who fall foul of it. Like they interpret it as being very brutal in terms of like the amount they end up paying or not being able to get tickets. But then in reality, what other mechanism could there be to actually to decide ticketing at these events, or who pays what? But, I mean, there might be. There's already talks of people boycotting the World Cup next year, but I think that's much more for other reasons rather than the cost of tickets. But then, one element of all the tournaments and the bigger games that we have over here now is that like a lot of the seats are already sold out to the corporate sponsors. So that also actually has increased this kind of dynamic pricing modus operandi, because there's obviously less and less tickets for normal fans now, because a lot of the corporate guys don't even sell out their location, or like they actually have a lot of empty seats.
That may also be subsidizing the legacy fans, though, as you call it as well, though, right?
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. But and then that's been a complaint for a lot of events here, not just in football, that once you see the corporate allocation, like especially around like England and Club Wembley, you see a lot of those seats empty, especially after half time. There's another commentator's favourite gripe and that sort of stuff. So, I mean, that's another potential backlash in itself, just the amount that's allocated to the corporate seats as well. So,
I mean, this goes back to the prawn sandwich era, so it's existed before dynamic pricing, but the question is whether dynamic pricing is the mechanism they use to sell off the remaining seats, I guess.
I mean, for the England matches, what I've heard people do is the people who are members of the England fan club, you need to go to a certain amount of games to qualify to buy the World Cup tickets, I think, at a reasonable price. So apparently people just go to the game to tap in and then just walk out.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, it's crazy.
But that's also regressive because that makes you have to buy more tickets, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's stupid.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway.
All right. So, any last words, Dan?
Well, I think that dynamic pricing and surveillance pricing are probably the wave of the future. There's not much we can do about it. But, again, it seems like it creates a lot of deadweight loss through society just so we can line some more corporate pockets. And I find it a little bit depressing overall. I'm waiting for those benefits of companies having all my data to start cropping up a bit more in my life, I guess.
Might be waiting a long time. Jason?
Nothing to add from what Dan said. I mean, it's another kind of, that's the way the world is, and that's the way the world is going. It's not, there's a lot of momentum behind it. It's very difficult to actually swim against the tide. But I think one aspect of it is that I did read a study that internet usage is going down amongst millennials and people up to age 40. So maybe everyone is getting back to the shops and just going back to realworld.com instead of actually shopping on the internet anymore. So that might be the actual, it might just be driven by natural trends reversal back to the norm. So,
wow, they might actually talk to each other.
yes.
Well, let's not go that far. For sure. On that note, that's all we've got time for this episode. Quick preview: the next episode will be about crypto.
Hurrah!
Not a controversial topic at all.
Not at all. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Yeah,
Take care.
bye.